watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
Police officers across the state are on the lookout for anyone behind the wheel who might be high in this new year and new era of legal recreational marijuana. But you don't have to be high for police officers to search your vehicle or even ask you to take a blood test. Earlier this week, I sat down with the executive director of the Illinois Sheriff's Association to find out how law enforcement is preparing to grapple with legal weed. As of New Year's Day, roughly 9.5 million adults in Illinois will be legally allowed to purchase, carry, and consume recreational marijuana.
That's correct. Anyone over 21 years of age.
Anyone over 21 years of age. That's a lot of product, and that's a lot of people introduced into our highways, our homes, and everywhere in Illinois. How well prepared are law enforcement to handle this new transition?
That's a very good question. Unfortunately, I don't think we're as well prepared nearly as we'd like to be. And part of the issue is that we don't have, one, the resources. We've not had the resources for quite some time in this state as law enforcement as a whole, but particularly as it relates to traffic safety issues and being able to determine the level of intoxication by folks that may very well consume cannabis. We have no standardized testing for that. So the only thing that we have to go by right now is standardized field sobriety testing that we could give somebody that we think is suspected under the influence of cannabis. And then ultimately, if we feel like they are, then we could take them to the hospital and do a blood draw on them.
What does that let's walk through that. What does that field testing look like?
It would be the same as of right now.
Walk a line?
It would be the walk and turn, the one leg stand. It would be the same tests that we use for people that we suspect are under the influence of alcohol today. The indicators may not all be the same, but we certainly would use the same standardized field sobriety testing that we do for alcohol. The indicators that we would look for are, bloodshot eyes, the smell of cannabis coming from, a vehicle or from an individual, glassy eyes, impaired driving that they may have, whatever the reason for the traffic stop was.
So let's walk through that process step by step so we can try and determine some examples and see how this might play out in real time. So let's say a sheriff's deputy pulls someone over for speeding, but as they're interacting with the driver, they happen to smell the scent of cannabis or marijuana in the vehicle. Is the presence of that smell right now, is that enough to justify probable cause for the sheriff to search the rest of the vehicle, have the driver come out of the car? Is that enough right now?
Yes.
Even though it's legal?
Correct. It is enough today, prior to January 1st, and it will be enough after January 1st as well. Because as the law is stated right now, if you're going to have possession of cannabis, that possession has to be in an odorless container if you are in a vehicle. So by the mere fact that I can smell it is probable cause for me to be able to search that vehicle.
So one step removed from that, say the same interaction, a deputy pulls someone over for speeding, they don't smell anything, but they happen to observe in the back seat sits an odorless container, sealed, locked, but it's clearly labeled marijuana. You've seen it, but it appears closed and it appears to be under the legal limit. Is that probable cause, the presence of the marijuana in the vehicle, to search the vehicle?
In a sealed container with no odor coming from it? No. That is not probable cause at that point.
Interesting. So there are some marijuana shops that are instructing their customers, or they plan to instruct customers, put it in your trunk. Just don't even flirt with it.
And I think from a law enforcement perspective, we would certainly agree with that, because then that puts it out of the reach of everyone. So if the driver can't get to it, the passenger can't get to it, then you've eliminated that probable cause for us to be able to search the vehicle at that point in time by it sitting in your trunk, because we don't even know it's there.
So if an officer sees a sealed, odorless container in the back seat and still uses that to take the driver out and search the vehicle, that's a violation?
I would not encourage, based on how the law reads to me today, I do not believe that you have probable cause to search that vehicle based on the fact that you cannot smell that. You simply see it in a sealed, odorless container. That's not a violation. They legally purchased that, and it's out of the reach of the driver.
You mentioned something a moment ago about road safety, and I know many people in our audience and across the state of Illinois are very interested to see how this evolves. You mentioned a possibility of dragging a driver to a hospital for a blood test. Mm-hmm. That's a bit more invasive, and it interrupts a person's schedule a bit more than just a speeding ticket. How is that you have to take them to a hospital? What if you're in rural downstate and the nearest hospital is an hour and a half away?
Well, I mean, that could certainly be something that you could face. The other thing that you could do too is you could rely on, EMTs to come in to draw blood for you. But our only way to be able to prove it, that it's actually in the blood, if you are willing to give the test, because in Illinois we have what's called implied consent. So by getting a driver's license, you have given implied consent that you will submit to voluntary testing, either for alcohol or drugs, if so requested by the officer that is stopping you at that time.
But blood or urine tests are more invasive to a person's privacy than just a breathalyzer.
That's
right?
Correct.
So this is impeding further. It's coming into closer contact with a person's civil liberties, their personal privacy. And a blood test is actually less accurate, according to the National Institutes of Health, than a saliva test or just a cheek swab. So why go, for example, if you take a blood test and someone has smoked or consumed marijuana days ago, the THC could still be present in their blood. How would you even know if they were actually high behind the wheel?
Because the level of nanograms that has to be in one's blood for whole blood is 5 nanograms. So when you test for that, that's the test level that you would be looking for. Now, is it the only thing? No. You're going to be looking for other indicators that might show impairment as well. But just like you could for alcohol, the example would be is that the legal limit for alcohol in the state of Illinois is 0.08. However, if you show impairment that somebody may be at a 0.06, they can still be arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol, because there's a window there that you could prove the impairment, plus you could base it on the driving that they're participating in on the roadways.
If a saliva test scientifically is determined to be more accurate, why then go to the blood testing?
Because we have no validated saliva test anywhere in the country right now. There are saliva tests that are being tested.
In Michigan, they're using them.
They're using them on an experimental basis, but they've not passed the Fry test, nor they have validated roadside safety test yet for us. We would love to have those as soon as possible. The other issue, at least at this point in time, based on the models that we've seen, is the fact that they are very cost prohibitive in terms of being able to do the test.
They're expensive.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to a breathalyzer test, which is the plastic tube that you take in and out. Otherwise, it's the same machine. That's your only cost other than purchasing the equipment itself.
Blood test would also be expensive, I imagine. Is the department picking up the cost of that? Is the driver picking up the cost of that? Has that been determined?
It has not been determined as of yet.
So on the first trip to the hospital for a blood test for a driver suspected of DUI, who gets the bill?
I'm going to say that probably the arresting agency is going to get the bill at that point in time.
Fascinating. So that could introduce a whole different discussion, a political discussion for another time, perhaps a budget hearing
right
down the line.
Mm-hmm.
So you've mentioned this again, but just to ask specifically, does the presence of marijuana alone constitute probable cause, or does there have to be some other erratic driving, bloodshot eyes, swerving, speeding, some other ingredient to justify an officer pulling someone over or taking them out of the car, searching the vehicle?
The presence in what would be considered an illegal containers or no container would be enough to be able to get into, be able to search that vehicle. That is in and of itself probable cause. If it is in a sealed odorless container, that would restrict that ability at that point in time. However, it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody is DUI. They could just be transporting it illegally, which is a different charge at that point in time. You're not going to charge them with a DUI if they haven't, smoked recently and you can't prove erratic driving or that they failed standardized field sobriety testing.
How do you enforce the quantity of the law here? Because if there's a limit on 30 grams, that's how much you can have. And say there's 4 people in the car, 4 adults, they each have 30 grams. You see the container, you know it's there, but how does an officer know if they have more than or less than the legal limit?
It's a very good question. The only thing I suppose that we could do at that moment in time would be able to have, scales of our own to be able to weigh the cannabis that they've got in their possession to see if in fact it is within that threshold of, 0 to 30 grams.
Are squad cars equipped with scales today?
Typically, no. We may have some. There are some that do, because let's say, for example, that someone was arrested for possession of whatever controlled substance, right? Then we would have a scale in some places, or go to a location that had a scale to be able to weigh that as part of that charge, because there are different categories and different thresholds that would precipitate or necessitate a different charge level.
I imagine this varies from county to county, but I'm hearing a lot of what you're saying include the prefix go to the hospital, go to the station, That's time. That's not efficient. It's not like a breathalyzer where you can just take it on the scene and you're done and you move on.
Absolutely.
Again, that goes back to the question of preparation. Are sheriff's offices, are they going to be burdened, do you expect, to a greater degree starting in January because of all this extra potential work that could present itself?
Certainly. I think that's certainly within the realm of possibility. And as you stated, you're talking about the time that it takes from one traffic stop to go to a hospital. If you want to talk about a rural area, well, what if that rural area only has one deputy on for the entire county? That deputy is then tied up, not being able to patrol, but then, dealing with this situation, which is also very important, but it may not be the only thing that they have to deal with, right? I mean, what do they do if they get another urgent call?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting discussion, certainly. Will state troopers, will sheriffs and deputies, or is this a county by county decision, will they be allowed to partake? Because, for example, if you were to go home on a Friday, absolutely not. An officer could go home on a Friday night and open a 6-pack of Coors Light, enjoy himself in the confines of his own home, and have a dinner with a glass of wine, but not marijuana. Why?
I have heard, well, part of the discussion during the veto session is that we wanted clarity, that sheriffs, chiefs, et cetera, wanted clarity in the law to make sure that they could withhold the ability for anybody that was under their employment, a sworn police officer, for example, to be able to partake in consumption of cannabis. So while it is an individual decision, we can have a zero tolerance policy in all police departments.
Any employer can.
Yeah, well, any sheriff's office, yeah, correct. But we could hold our sheriff's deputies, we can hold them to the standard that they cannot consume cannabis at any point in time, whether they're on duty or off duty.
Is there something specific about the product that makes it prohibited for law enforcement?
Well, one thing would be...
Other than the history, I suppose.
Well, it's still illegal federally. And a lot of different municipalities and sheriff's offices, they may very well get funding from the federal government as it relates to grants or something else. So it would still be illegal. And the other thing is that we don't know for sure how long cannabis stays in one system, right? So the concern would be is that, let's say that I, Jim Kajchuk, on a Saturday night, I partake and I don't work again until Monday. I get involved in an officer-involved shooting on Monday, and my blood's tested, and I've consumed cannabis. That's a serious problem, level of liability. What caused, was my line of thinking off as a result of the consumption of the product? I don't know. I think that law enforcement, obviously, as you know, we were opposed to this issue. We understand that it's becoming the law in the state as of January 1st, so we're trying to figure out our way through this, but we still don't think it's the right thing to do for our communities or certainly for our employees.
Mm-hmm. As we've discussed at great length, there will be millions of people who have the possibility to carry these products on the road, but there's also a select number of people, who can grow marijuana plants legally inside their home. Now that's a sacred place. That's where a person has the utmost privacy in the four walls of their own home. But where is the line there on where law enforcement can investigate to make sure that there are no more than 5 plants per medical patient? And how do you determine who is and who is not able to have a medical plant in their home?
Well,
or how aggressively will you be looking to enforce that?
It's probably going to depend on jurisdiction to jurisdiction, based on the level of resources that one has, the level of complaints that we get. Let's say, for example, that we get a significant number of complaints, that they can smell the odor of cannabis coming from this residence. If it is a burnt situation where, and I'm going to kind of parcel this out a little bit, the difference between consumption in your home, if I lived in an apartment complex, a lot of those kind of complaints are probably going to be much more, I'm sorry, but that's a civil issue. You're going to need to contact your landlord about the concern that you have with the resident in, 2A.
But someone in a residential neighborhood living in their own home, growing up to 5 plants because they're a medical patient, does that person run the risk of getting a knock on their door from a law enforcement agency?
Well, I would say that it could happen in terms of the knock on the door, but in terms of our ability to determine probable cause to get a warrant, it's probably going to be more difficult at that point in time. And one of the things that law enforcement asked for was some sort of a registration program so that we knew, something could be sent to us to say, okay, at 1115 South Walnut, this person is a medical cannabis patient, and they are going to grow up to 5 plants, 5 inches tall, and that way we know that that's going on there. So we have that as a heads up. Otherwise, right now we're running into the challenge where you've got this coming up. You've also got hemp that's growing now in the state, and that's creating a lot of confusion from law enforcement because the general public doesn't know the difference. And honestly, it's very difficult to be able to tell the difference in the plants between hemp and marijuana.
Mm-hmm. So from law enforcement to potential customers, people who might want to try legally when it becomes available, what's your advice to that person from the trip to the dispensary and back home again? How would you advise that person to handle this now legal product that would have got them in a little bit of trouble just a few days ago?
I think the simplest way and the most responsible way to do this is if you go into a dispensary and you make a legal purchase of the product, you can get up to 30 grams of cannabis at that point in time, the leafy substance. Take that. I would suggest putting it in your trunk, taking it home, and if you want to consume the product there at your home, do so at your leisure. But make sure that there's an adequate amount of time. And you're going to ask me what adequate means, and I'm not really sure I know what that means. But I would certainly give it till the next day before I was driving the car again.
Mm. And you're confident that on these blood tests, there are not going to be false positives or people who are being charged for driving high days after they ever consumed?
I think it will be, I'm confident that should not happen, no. Because, to a large extent, we've been dealing with cannabis for a long period of time. And one of the things that we've been dealing with cannabis is as it was associated with decriminalization of the marijuana laws several years ago, 5 years ago, when decrim occurred. So to some extent, we're already dealing with some of those challenges. Mm-hmm. I think the bigger concern is that the first of the year, it wasn't just the illicit market that we have been worried about to this point in time. Now we're worried about not just the illicit, but also the legal side of things.
And that's an interesting question too. With all of this extra product that will be out in the public domain, in people's cars, traveling from point A to point B, the presence of that alone, how does that complicate, or how might that complicate law enforcement's ongoing efforts to crack down on the black market, on the illicit market, where there are illegal drug traffickers trying to move very similar products? Does that make it more difficult to track and trace?
Absolutely.
How do you combat that?
It's a good question. I guess we're going to find out come the first of the year because, the illicit market, could very well use those same sealed odorless containers, right, to transport their items as well. So we're not going to know the difference. I'm not going to be an expert in terms of what came from a dispensary and a cultivation center versus what came from the street and a cartel located, somewhere else.
Isn't there a logo or a stamp from the state that would help to identify?
On the container itself, yes. But what if I use that same container and I put that illicit substance in there? I'm not going to know the difference.
Right. And in tracking the movement of it, without divulging trade secrets per se, how just the presence of it, the movement of it, does that make it more difficult, or how do you plan? Is there a plan in place right now to parse out which is legal, which is not? How do you confront that?
I think every jurisdiction, no statewide plan that I'm aware of. Every jurisdiction is probably going to handle this differently based on the level of resources that they've got. What kind of drug interdiction units do they have? Do they have, the MIGs? Which is, the cooperative efforts to try to identify different drug circumstances. But yeah, it's certainly going to be another challenge that law enforcement, quite honestly, we don't need.
Well, Jim, a fascinating discussion, perhaps a discussion that will become only more fascinating by this time next year after a year of data and different interactions are in the books and we can review where we've gone.
Absolutely.
Thanks for your time.
No, thank you. Thank you.
When we come back, a look at the biggest political fight on the horizon in 2020, the ballot question in November. Should Illinois adopt a progressive income tax? What the business community has to say to Governor Pritzker's idea. That's next.